So we're ready to start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Hack, and I will be your MC this evening. Firstly, we are going to start off with the Canadian anthem. So our anthem singer tonight is Miss Vanessa Valenti. Vanessa is a singer from Edmonton. Even at the young age of 13, her resume is filled with accomplishments of a singer twice her age. She sung the national anthem at Rexall Place for the Edmonton Oil Kings, as well as for the Canadian finals game of the Leduc Telus Cup. She participated in the 2011-2012 Edmonton Singing Christmas Tree. Recently, Vanessa also had the honor to sing for Alison Redford at the premiere dinner this past May. Vanessa has always been inspired to share a gift and help others. Participating in events such as the St. Valentine's Day Hair Massacre for cancer research has been a rewarding experience for her, and she's excited to expand her influence that children have on their community. Please welcome Miss Vanessa Valenti. Please rise for the Canadian National Anthem.
Oh, Canada, terre d'un long sailleur, ton front naissant de fleurs en gloria, car ton bras s'est porté le pays, il s'est porté la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Thank you, Vanessa, for that beautiful bilingual version of O Canada. So now I would like to introduce, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Singmar and his wife, Saroj. Dr. Singmar and his wife, Saroj, are known to most Albertans as entrepreneur and philanthropist. According to our mayor, Stephen Mandel, Prem is a passionate Albertan. He's a huge supporter of unending numbers of charities in Edmonton. Singmar and his family have demonstrated their support for the community in Edmonton through a series of donations to the arts and education in the city. He and his wife Saroj donated $1.5 million to the University of Alberta in 2006 to create the Saroj and Prem Singmar Chair in the Classical Indian Polity and Society. And in 2008, they donated $1.2 million to the Art Gallery of Alberta. Singmar also sits on the Board of Trustees for the Alberta Cancer Foundation and the Advisory Council of the Alberta branch of the Immigrant Access Fund. Dr. Singmar has been a supporter of DEEP's program and activities, and he has been a major sponsor for all events hosted so far. He is a source of encouragement and inspiration for DEEP. On behalf of DEEP, we are happy that you accepted to be the chief of guests for tonight's event. Thank you, Saroj and Dr. Singmar, for your unfailing support to our cause of peace. And first, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Prof. Deepa Kumar. Deepa Kumar is an associate professor of media studies and Middle Eastern studies at the Rutgers University. She is an author of Islamophobia and Politics of Empire and Outside the Box, Corporate Media Globalization and the UPS Strike. In her book, Outside the Box, Corporate Media Globalization, she presents a critical analysis of how labor struggles are presented and packaged by the corporate media, and how the bias can be counteracted. Following the Danish cartoon controversy, Kumar wrote an article against the publication of the cartoons titled "Danish Cartoons, Racism Has No Place on the Left." Her article was read by tens of thousands and posted on the websites around the world. Her latest book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, was written in response to the events of 9/11. This book examines the historic relationship between anti-Muslim racism and empire building. Kumar offers a sweeping historical analysis of the changing views of Muslims in the West. Ladies and gentlemen, can I please present to you Professor Kumar? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Deep for hosting this event. I actually have a presentation with slides as well as audio visual. Can you hear me?
No.
No. Now, can you hear me?
That's better.
No?
Better. Yes, we can. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Okay, thank you all for coming out. Thanks to Deep for hosting this event. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to speak first for about half an hour, and then I'll be followed by Sadia Tour, my friend, and we will probably have Q&A and discussion following that. Looks like this internet is going to keep interrupting, so we'll see how it goes. So, as Amna just said, my latest book is called Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. So let me begin by defining the term Islamophobia. In a nutshell, it is anti-Muslim racism. That is to say, a prejudice that is felt about an entire group based on the actions and based on caricatures of whole people. So, in large part, this is a form of cultural racism, even though there is a biological element, and I will come to the biological element shortly. But suffice it to say that the underlying logic of this cultural racism is that if someone is Muslim, then automatically we can say that they have certain characteristics, and we can pin them and label them in certain sorts of ways. So one of these characteristics, and particularly a characteristic which is now taken for granted, is the idea that Muslims are violent, right? Muslims, it is believed, are programmed by the Quran to be terrorists. This is, of course, the dominant trope that we encounter these days, which is why 2 months ago, when the Boston bombing took place at the marathon, I'm sure you saw the coverage of that. I was away, I was in Japan at the time, but there was no way that you could avoid it. This became worldwide news very quickly. But almost as soon as it was learned that Muslims were to blame for it, of course the term terrorism was immediately applied. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to challenge you to actually think critically about this term terrorism, because it's a very convenient term that gets used for the actions of some people and not the actions of others or the actions of governments. So for instance, if we're talking about violence against innocent people and the murder of innocent people, certainly in the United States in the last just 2 years, we have seen at least 3 incidents where there has been indiscriminate violence against ordinary people, which actually killed far more civilians, far more innocent people. I'll name them. In Tucson, Arizona, for instance, 19 people were shot and 6 people died as a result of this. In Aurora, Colorado, in a movie theater after the screening of the film Batman, 70 people were shot, 12 of whom died. And then at Sandy Hook Elementary School, 26 people were shot, 20 of whom, by the way, were children, and all 26 of them died. But the word terrorism was never used to describe the people who carried out these shootings. Adam Lanza, Loeffner, and so on, because these were white guys, right? And so there's a very convenient way in which brown men, whether they are Muslim or not, have automatically been called terrorists when they carry out such acts. And this logic does not apply just to North America and to the United States. This logic is global. We saw the same sort of logic in relation to the London killing that just took place last week, when again it was discovered that Nigerians were involved. the media, of course, went crazy talking about terrorism, and the conservative-led government unleashed a racist backlash. And the result, sadly, was predictable. There have been 200 reports of Islamophobic attacks barely 6 days after the London incident. So that is all by way of introduction to say that in the time that we find ourselves today, we have a very particular construction of the Muslim enemy. And what I want to argue is that this doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of the political arena, it comes out of the political sphere, but it is echoed in every sphere, including the mass media, including Hollywood. So let me begin actually by showing you some Hollywood images and knitting together the kind of stories that we are subjected to. Now the sound apparently is cannot be moved further than that door, so we're going to go back and forth so you can actually listen and see the visuals on that screen.
God's command is?
To kill Americans. It's your government you fight, not you. It's your White House. One day I will go there. I will drive a truck. And truck it will blow.
You have killed our women and our children. Bombed our cities from afar like cowards. And you dare to call us terrorists?
Brandon White's boyfriend.
Husband? Yeah, I was.
You didn't hear? She was in Paris showing the fall collection. She got hit by a burst of terrorist crossfire, Palestinians, French police.
Oh my God. They found me. I don't know how, but they found me. Look for the body! Who? What do you think? The Libya! Holy shit!
Attacking our wavelength. You're attacking our wavelength.
There's no borders, no customs. They can go anywhere in the U.S. There's nothing to stop them.
That one in the attic section. When you run into one of the grand Northeast gangsters, they'll kill you, son. They'll slit your throat.
Do you understand what I'm saying? American citizen. American citizen.
Before we start drilling, where should we park the camels?
If you want to watch the entire thing, it's called Planet of the Arabs, and it's available. You can Google it easily. I just showed you the first minute or two, and this is a compilation. I'm sure many of you recognize these films, right? These are popular Hollywood films from the last 20, 30, sometimes going back even longer than that, as you saw with the Disney cartoons. And there's a certain image of the Muslim enemy that comes across through this, and that, of course, is the idea of the violent terrorist, the person who's bent on destroying American civilization. So today in my presentation, what I'm going to argue is that really the Muslim enemy is a construction. That is to say, it is not natural. It is a story that is put together, and that story actually is one that is historically rooted and that is mobilized by the elite in various societies. And the main goal of this story, of this Muslim enemy image, is really to justify larger political agendas. And so in that sense, I'm going to argue that there is no ancient and natural sort of conflict between East and West. The idea that there is a clash of civilizations. You may have come across this term. It was a term that was coined by Bernard Lewis back in 1990. It was popularized by a political scientist known as Samuel Huntington. And it's based on the idea that there are 7 or 8 civilizations, apparently, the West, Islamic, Confucian, and so on, and they all have these unique cultures. And because these cultures are so different, they are bound to clash with one another. So that was Samuel Huntington's thesis, is that in the post-Cold War world, conflict will be characterized by cultural differences, which is why it becomes easy now to see markers of Muslim culture as somehow being the other of Europe, or somehow being not at home in European countries, right? The ban on minarets, the ban on the veil, and so on and so forth. And I'm actually going to argue against this thesis by starting in the 11th century and coming all the way up to the present. And I'm going to argue instead that these mobilizations of these images are actually about politics, ultimately, not about religion. So to begin in the 7th century, we know that Islam, of course, comes into being in the 7th century in Arabia. And within a few short decades, the Muslim armies, of course, defeat the neighboring Persian and Byzantine empires and take over large parts of their territory. So much so that by the time we come to the 8th century, conquests begin in Spain. They continue through the entire Iberian Peninsula, and they reach all the way into Italy. Now, at this time, European rulers, of course, were alarmed by these new enemies. They didn't like the incursions they were making into their territory, but they didn't see the Muslims as being different from any of the other enemies that they encountered. People like the Slavs, the Northmen, the Magyars, and so on. All of these people were just seen as barbarians at Europe's doors. There was no difference between any of them. And so that's why this first 400 years of contact between Europe and the Middle East and North Africa is called the Age of Ignorance, where there wasn't any specific understanding of Islam and no notion really of a Muslim enemy in particular. But this changes in the 11th century. And there is an entire effort actually to take on Islam, because not only is there an established Muslim empire by this point called Al-Andalus, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but Christians are starting to convert to Islam. And there's a reason now for various European rulers, as well as the Vatican, the seat of the papacy, to take on this religion and to discredit it. And there are 3 lines of attack that they would forward. One, that Islam's revelations are just wrong, that they are pseudo-prophecies, that Muhammad himself, the prophet, is a false prophet, and that Islam is a violent religion. And of course, you look at these 3 lines of attack, and today the one that sticks out, for almost a millennium, is this notion that Islam is violent. Of course, at the time, the genesis of this notion was the idea that the only reason that Christians and Jews are converting to Islam is because they're being forced at a gunpoint. Well, there were no guns back then, but at the point of a sword to convert, and that's why they're converting. In fact, that's not true. When the Muslim armies reached various European cities, they gave people a choice, just as they did in the Middle East, which is you convert if you want to, or you pay a tax and you continue to... Can you hear me? Okay. And you continue to pay a tax and keep your own religion. Okay. Thank you. And so here is how one medieval scholar puts it in terms of all of the kinds of negative images that were generated back in the 11th century. This is Norman Daniel, and the slide is up there if you want to follow along. It was believed that Muhammad was said to be a magician, a sorcerer who used his evil powers to produce fake miracles and thereby seduce men into embracing his false doctrines. It was believed that he was a renegade Christian priest, Perhaps even a cardinal whose frustrated lust for power led him to seek revenge on the church by propagating his own pernicious teachings. He was sexually promiscuous, an adulterer, promoted licentiousness in order to ensnare men into depravity, and it was believed that his death was as disgusting and shameful as his life, for he was devoured by pigs or suffocated by pigs during epileptic fit. You know what I mean? It was just the worst kind of propaganda that you could expect only the most right-wing people today to actually put forward. And the question is why? Why in the 11th century was there a need to produce this kind of propaganda? And you saw this propaganda in the novels at the time, you saw it being performed in plays, you saw it coming out of the Vatican and so forth. Where did it come from, and why did this exist? Well, it had to do with, as I argued earlier, a political agenda. It's about two things. First, the Crusades, which was really the original holy war, was not even a holy war. It was an attempt by a particular group of people who had taken over the Vatican to enlarge their political power over a united Christian Europe. And this is how they were going to do it. They were basically going to say, Christians, do not fight your brothers, come together, and this way they could extend spiritual authority over a united Christian Europe, and further, by inciting hatred against the Muslims in Jerusalem and so on, extend their influence into the Christian Byzantine region of the Middle East and of North Africa and so forth. So even the original Holy War, the Crusades, was really all about politics. It was about the extension of political power, just as the Reconquest, the Reconquista as it's called, and that is where the rulers of Spain and Portugal and so on, the earlier rulers of Spain and Portugal, wanted to get rid of the Muslim rulers at the time. And so how do you do that? You create this image of this horrible enemy, and then you rile people to join your armies, you rile people to join the Crusades, and so on and so forth. But even though this sort of awful image of Muslims was quite dominant in Europe in the 11th century, there was another image as well, and that is the image in Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is the name given to the 800-year Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. And what was happening at the time is that after the fall of Rome, when Europe was going through a period of cultural stagnation known as the Dark Ages, this region, including Baghdad and elsewhere, was fantastically prosperous, right? And so what you saw is that a number of scholars flocked to Al-Andalus because the Muslim rulers were actually taking and translating all of the knowledges from Greek society, from Persian society, from Indian societies and so on, and building on this knowledge in all sorts of ways. So some of the most advanced work was going on in Al-Andalus at this time. So as you might imagine, ordinary people who lived in the Iberian Peninsula under the Muslim rulers had a very different opinion about Muslims, and therefore they could see through and cut through some of this propaganda in a way that other Europeans could not. And I have a small clip from a BBC documentary that I'm going to show you. It's only over the last 10 years or so that there has been a lot of research and scholarship into the role that Muslims have played in the advancement of European history. In fact, if it weren't for the development in architecture, in medicine, in astronomy, and so on, Europe would never have come out of the Dark Ages. The Renaissance or the rebirth of Europe would never actually have happened. And so let me show you a clip from this documentary. It's called An Islamic History of Europe.
200 years, Cordoba grew. The 11th century saw a flood of converts drawn to Islam. These were mostly Christians inspired by Abdurrahman II's benign rule. the mosque had to be extended, and Cordoba began to attract some of the brightest stars from the Middle East.
There's a chap called Ziria who arrives from Baghdad, and Ziria was often described as a Beau Brummel of Moorish Spain, because he was like a master musician. He was based in Baghdad, and he fell out with his master, the guy who was teaching him music. Came here as an exile and brought with him all the fashions from Baghdad. Baghdad was like, the Paris or the New York of this day. And what happens is you've got this influx of ideas from Baghdad to Cordoba. So he sort of brought things with him like toothpaste and deodorants, and things like short hair. Like men and women all had long hair until Ziria turned up, and he said, no, look, everybody in Baghdad, man, they just have short hair. You've got to just cut your hair. It meant that they're sort of part of this bigger picture, and it's like part of a much more sophisticated picture. Absolutely. I mean, we're talking at this time when London was a bunch of mud huts by the Thames. I mean, this is the famous thing. Cordoba, they had street lighting, they had sewage wells, they had running water, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the problem is that we tend to view Western civilization, but there's this huge element missing from that picture, which is the Islamic element, and that comes through Spain, mostly through Spain, partly through Sicily as well. Right. So you've got the Greeks and the Indians and the Persians who had not been very well connected until that point.
And had their little sort of sealed areas of achievement.
That's right. So what the Muslims do is they conquer all these territories, join all these beads of mercury together, and it becomes this great font of knowledge.
And the critical thing is that a lot of the works that they were translating from the Greeks in the Western world by this stage had been forgotten. So,
if you want to watch the rest of that documentary, it's a BBC documentary called An Islamic History of Europe. Now, I spent a lot of time on the 11th century, both to show you that this is the genesis of this idea of this violent, horrible Muslim enemy that must be kicked out of Spain, that, against whom a holy war must be waged, and so on. But at the same time, we also see in Al-Andalus great respect and an environment that was known as convivencia, which is mutual respect between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And I think that's important because these sorts of contradictory moments are actually more explanatory of the relationship between ordinary people which in the East and West. At the same time, I want to emphasize that even while the leadership in Europe were propagating these horrible images of the Muslim enemy, they were perfectly happy to make alliances with their Muslim counterparts in the Middle East, in North Africa, and so forth, because it was useful for them to do that. This was during the Crusades, right? Christians and Muslims colluding with one another because it was politically convenient. And the same is true even later. Europeans would ally with the powerful Turkish Ottoman Empire to fight against other powerful European enemies. And so, in fact, the Ottomans wound up taking the side of the Protestant Reformation against the earlier seat of Catholicism, which was the Habsburg Empire. So, in other words, there's a difference between propaganda and images that are used to rile up the public and foster hatred and chauvinism versus the kind of alliances that people at the top of society make with one another, and you see that even today. I want to, in the interest of time, move on to the moment in the United States when this sort of enemy image again comes into being, the Muslim enemy image. And this is, of course, in the context of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and in particular the hostage crisis, when US diplomatic personnel were taken hostage for 444 days. And this became front page headline news. And every day Americans were fed on a steady diet of this mythical thing called Islam, and in particular, Ayatollah Khomeini became the face of all things horrible, right? And Edward Said, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's an excellent scholar, used to teach at Columbia University and has written some amazing books, including one called Orientalism, talks about how the images of Iranians at that time really consisted of a couple of things. Angry Iranians marching in streets, mobs with angry faces, burning flags, and then on the other hand, the American families being shown as real human beings, as people who are tearful, as people with aspirations, with hopes and dreams for themselves and so on, whereas of course a complete dehumanization of the Iranian people. And in case you think that this is an image that died in the 1970s, think again. I don't know if you saw the film Argo, Ben Affleck's film, which won the best Oscar for, the Oscar for the Best Picture this year. Again, if you watch that film, it's exactly about this kind of dehumanization of the Iranians and of course a complete humanization of the Americans. But here is an image from 1979 of Khomeini versus the then President Carter. And there you have it. I'm trying to emphasize this idea of a construction. That is not a photograph of Khomeini. That is in fact a sketch. And he's presented as quite demonic, satanic in fact, against the rather angelic looking Carter. He even has a halo, right, on his head, a sort of, great leader kind of image. At any rate, this is the sort of image of what would come to be seen as Islam. But again, the language of terrorism really is the one that would start to take off in the 1980s. Very quickly, the term terrorism has been around for a while, at least since the late 19th century. This is actually the subject of my next book, which I'm working on. But in the post-Second World War era, you actually start to see that the colonial powers, France, Britain, and so on, would use this term terrorist to talk about the people who were trying to engage in independence movements and de-link themselves from the colonial powers. Of course, even up until the 90s, Nelson Mandela, who led the South African struggle against apartheid, was considered a terrorist, right? So that term gets used very purposely to sort of delegitimize the struggle for independence, for national self-determination, and so forth. And Israel, of course, plays a really huge part in this language and shaping this language. They hold two very important conferences, in particular the Jonathan Institute, which is this group that Benjamin Netanyahu was in charge of, held two conferences, one in 1979 in Jerusalem, the other in Washington, D.C. in 1984, at which world leaders are invited. And a very clear argument is made by the Likud party, in particular by the conservative Zionists, in which they try to show that it's not just the Soviet Union, remember this was the Cold War, it's not just the Soviet Union that the West should be afraid of and see as the enemy, but terrorists as well. And in particular, the terrorist enemy at that time was, of course, the PLO, which was struggling for the rights of the Palestinian people. But through the course of the 80s, as I say in the slide, the Arab terrorist would become the Islamic terrorist after the Iranian Revolution, the birth of Hezbollah, later Hamas, and so forth. And this is the kind of picture that gets drawn by the Likud neoconservative connection, which if people have questions about, we can go into in the Q&A. So let me start to come to a close with this. There is nothing natural about the image of the Muslim enemy. And it is not a coincidence that today when we think of the Muslim or the Islamic terrorist, it is the image of the brown man that comes to mind, right? It is the Arab or the Iranian or the South Asian, but not the Indonesian, right? We never see Indonesian men being demonized in this way, even though Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. And that is because there is a politics of oil behind all of this. That is, the West cannot secure its oil interests through the use of war or drone strikes or special operation executions and so on by saying we want oil because energy is very important in order to run the economies of various countries. Instead, these sorts of enemies have to be constructed in order to win the consent of domestic population. And so the question really is, what do we do? How do we fight back against this kind of demonization? How do we fight back against Islamophobia? Now, there are many groups that have taken to educating people about the teachings of Islam, and certainly this does not hurt. There are those who have taken great pains to show that there's a lot of pacifist tendencies within the religion. There's a great book by Amitabh Pal called Islam Means Peace. Interfaith meetings are also things that people have engaged in. And certainly, meeting people who are part of this enemy is useful. This is why I talked about Al-Andalus. But ultimately, I think this is not enough, because the people who benefit from this kind of racism aren't going to change their minds simply by being shown the truth, as it were. And certainly in the case of the United States, where I live, often people will use the example of Japanese Americans. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the 1940s, there was a massive backlash, as you may know, against Japanese Americans. Hundreds of thousands were targeted and put into jail, into concentration camps, as it were. And there was a long period where they were seen as enemies in all sorts of ways. Eventually, of course, during the Reagan era, an apology was issued. And so some people have drawn the lesson that this is because Japanese Americans really integrated into American society and showed what loyal citizens they are and so forth. Well, I disagree with that particular interpretation, because I think that what was happening is that Japan, by that point, on a geopolitical level, had been brought so much into the US fold that it was no longer a threat. And that's why, at the same time that the apology was being given to Japanese Americans for what was done for them, China was now beginning to emerge as the enemy, and films about the Chinese and rhetoric about the Chinese was starting to come into being. So in other words, this is about politics, and if we want to fight this kind of racism, we need to do this on the political terrain, because that's where this ideology and rhetoric really comes from. And so with that, I'll come to a close and hand it to Sadia. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, Sat Sri Akal, and Assalamu Alaikum. As Dr. Qasim Khan says, you're the face of the Deep, so I have to be here to talk about, basically what Deep is all about, as you see here: defy enmity, encourage peace. I will just want to erase a misconception among the people in Edmonton that we're here to probably dismantle the nuclear stations in India and Pakistan. No, sorry, we're not doing that. We are just trying to have a roadmap to peace between India and Pakistan. That's where, issues which could go forward to trigger those nuclear hungry people to destroy this region. So that is what we're trying to do, is educate. So educate peace, in my opinion, is to bring these scholars. Like last year we got Vijay Prashad and Rafi Zakaria. Before that we had Doug Roche. And this year we have two speakers, Deepa Kumar, who gave a very comprehensive lecture, Constructing the Muslim Enemy, from Crusades to 9/11. And will be followed by Sadia Toor. She's going to talk about culture, power, and politics in Pakistan. So these topics actually is a deterrent to conflict. And anything which is a deterrent to conflict is a way forward to peace. And that's what we all are about. DEEP stands for that. So any misconception among the people that, well, see, are you going to destroy the nuclear arsenals in Pakistan and India? No. Please. We're not doing that. It's not my business. We are encouraged. We can't establish peace. Okay. I just read last week, no, maybe 2 weeks before, a great scholar, Naam Chowdhury. He gave an interview, and he said, people asked him, what do you think? Are there any prospects of peace? He said, that's a difficult question to answer. He said, I have one recent example in a rural area of Yemen, a peaceful people. They loved Americans. They said, well, they're great people. But after 2 drone attacks, they became anti-American. The message which I feel he gave, and I think I echo with him. Drone attacks really don't help peace. And I think the Americans and the West have to understand, please, it's very essential to sit on the table, and dialogue is the first step towards peace. We saw that earlier in Ireland. It is through dialogue you can establish peace. So an organization like us, we will probably educate people on that, value peace. So I have 3 announcements and a very sad announcement for people who know and may not know. One of our founding members of DEEP, his name was Azmat Qureshi, also known as Shahryar, a very good friend of mine. I spent almost more than 2 decades with him. Understood him as a person, understood him as a poet, and we lost him in March. I have his son and daughter here. Can you please stand up, Mavish and Zaid? So here, Zaid is Shahryar's son, and he's carrying some legacies of his father. He himself writes poetry. I don't know about Mary whether you write poetry or not. So please, we should stand, I would say, a moment of silence for the departed soul. Another announcement we have is basically in a family. Indranil Chaudhary lost his mother, a great Indian musical genius, late Purnima Chaudhary. Where is it? And his wife Lipika lost his mother almost similar month, a month before. So we have 2 very sad incidents and losses in the DEEP's extended family. So, I'd like to have a moment of silence for these 2 departed souls. Thank you, and now I would be calling in my mentor for so many years. I didn't go to work with him as a grad student. I'm somebody from sciences, chemical sciences, nothing to do with political science. But he's been a source of encouragement, and I would say a real teacher. He has been an inspiration for DEEP. And I tell you, I cannot, 3 individuals which sit on our patrons, Dr. Salim Qureshi, Dr. Banu, and Dr. Regula, they're instrumental. While we are just beginning to walk, we'll probably one day, maybe in years to come, we will start running too. Because this is for a very focused audience. Our message will slowly creep into the political circles. So I am very thankful for people from the Alberta Legislative Assembly, Honorable Sohail Qadri, and another friend of mine, Honorable Naresh Bharadwaj, who they're here, and they may carry some messages what this society is all about. And I'm also thankful to Sohail, who provided an ad for this booklet. So thank you, Sohail. So again, I will not take too much of your time, and I'll ask Dr. Salim Qureshi to express his opinion about us and the event. Thank you.
Wasim, let me tell you, I was in Europe somewhere in the 50s, and I was struck by the fact that there were Germans working in France, French working in Germany, English working in Germany, France. And this was so soon after the most devastating war in the history of the world. And I was surprised that there was no animosity anymore. The war was in the past, it was gone, and now they were all Europeans. In talking with Wasim much later, it occurred to me that we are so many here in this town, people from India, from Pakistan, Hindus, Muslims. Why is there no dialogue going on between us? Why do we keep in our separate cocoon? And then Wasim came up with the idea of creating a forum where people from these different parts can come together and can have, am I not being heard? We can have a dialogue, we can have discussion, we can talk with each other. After all, we speak the same language, we wear the same kind of clothes, we eat the same kind of food. And the partition is almost 6 decades back. Why are we still remembering that partition and not looking forward? And so I wholeheartedly work with Wasim, and Deep is the brainchild of Wasim, the idea of creating a forum where people who may not be exactly alike, but they can come together and they can talk with each other, because we do share a lot more with each other than we do with any other people in the whole world. Now, having said all of this, does not mean that we forget that we are different. To ignore difference never removes difference. It perhaps exacerbates it. And I have been thinking about it. I think the best way of dealing with the differences is to honor each other's difference. And I'm reminded of a great Persian poet who lived many centuries back. What did he say? The great Hafiz. He said, Hafiza, garbasl khwahi, sulh kulba khatwa, ba musalman, Allah Allah, ba birahman, Ram Ram. Hafiz, if you want harmony, be at peace with everybody, be he a plebeian or a patrician. When you meet a Muslim, say Allah Allah. When you meet a Hindu, say Ram Ram. And so I think recognition and honor of each other's difference brings us closer and creates greater harmony than always talking about what separates us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to have this opportunity to express a few words. And although my words that I have just spoken are not as profound as the words spoken by our invited guests. And I was very much impressed by Deepak Kumar's narration of history. I just wanted to add one word to it. Terrorism is used like communism or nationalism, as if there is a philosophy behind it. There is no philosophy. This is Bush speak. And terror is a tactic. It's not an ideology, not a philosophy, but it's commonly being used. And of course, the United States has always used it. You didn't mention Nasser. In the 50s, Nasser was the face of the opposition. And of course, in the 70s, Khomeini became. Nobody remembers that in 53, the Americans spent $1 million through the CIA to actually upset Dr. Mossadegh and the start of democracy in Iran. and they claim to be champions of democracy. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Qureshi. So I just want to make a few words on Sadia Tour, our next speaker. Sadia is an associate professor of sociology and social work at the City University of New York, and recently published a book about Pakistan titled The State of Islam, Culture and Cold War Politics in Pakistan. The State of Islam tells the story of the Pakistani nation state through the lens of the Cold War, and more recently on the War of Terror, in order to shed light on the domestic and international processes behind the rise of militant Islam across the world. Dr. Tour uses the tools of cultural studies and post-colonial theory to understand what is at stake in discourses of Islam, socialism, and the nation in Pakistan. According to Sadia, the book attempts to subvert this discourse by highlighting the complexity of Pakistan's history and the primacy of people's struggles within it, as well as the role of the U.S.-aligned establishment in quashing these struggles and alternative political and cultural visions they embody. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Sadia Tour.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to read most of my talk out because I'm always concerned about losing the complexity and nuance, and sometimes when I'm talking off the record, I get carried away and then I lose the thread of what I'm saying. Thank you so much to all of you for coming out to hear us talk. Thank you to Deep, to Wasim, to Dr. Qureshi, to all the wonderful people who extended their hospitality to us since we arrived yesterday. You've given me a very great opening, Dr. Qureshi, because I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about anti-communism and the Cold War. so let's see how it goes. Okay, so I usually begin my talk with discussing opening with a discussion of the cover of my book, because I chose the photograph that's on the cover very consciously. And I'm going to explain to you why I chose it. Some of you may already have a sense of why, but I think it's a good way to kind of start a discussion on Pakistan today. It's the cover is on the invitations and the brochure for this event. So the image on the cover of this book, a contemporary photograph of a women workers' protest against rising food prices, captures the spirit of a variety of movements that inhabit the political landscape of Pakistan today. The cadence of the half-hidden sign in the front that says "Gareeb Bachao, Gurbat Mukao," save the poor, end poverty, echoes the beat of a progressive sentiment that was at the heart of the newly decolonized and independent nation that came into being on 14th August 1947. So although beset with huge problems and seemingly insurmountable odds, and despite the trauma of the violence of partition, ordinary Pakistanis at that time were hopeful of forming a society in which they would have a place and a voice. The anti-colonial movement in the subcontinent had been suffused with a radicalism that had led many to believe that the departure of the British would herald an egalitarian social system. While the period following independence was one of contestation for the political and economic soul of the nation, it was one which progressive forces believed they could help shape. Today, the Western media has no space for images such as the one on the cover, or for stories that contradict the dominant narrative of Pakistan as the fountainhead of extremism. Alternate frameworks for understanding the country and its people are conspicuously absent from both mainstream media and academic discourse. Within the historiography of the subcontinent, the establishment of Pakistan is projected as the culmination of an essentially religious movement which destroyed the secular fabric of India. The problems that Pakistan faces today, particularly the rise of religious extremism, are therefore presumed to be the poisonous fruit of this flawed foundation. So my book was a small attempt to disrupt this mainstream account of Pakistani history, and I try to offer an alternative narrative. And this narrative seeks to explain Pakistan's present reality as a result of a complex and contingent historical process with both domestic and international dimensions. It aims to highlight resistance and struggle and to document the important and historical role played by the Pakistani left in the culture and politics of the country. So one of my goals when I was writing this book was to resurrect the important role played by the Pakistani left from the very inception of the nation state in challenging both the ruling establishment, which at this time was purportedly secular, and the forces of the religious right. While it is usually either ignored or dismissed as irrelevant within the mainstream discourse on Pakistan, the left's influence on Pakistan's culture and politics has been significant and often far greater than its organizational strength would warrant. Many, if not most, of Pakistan's most well-respected writers, poets, intellectuals, and journalists, especially in the early period of its history, were affiliated either with the Communist Party or the left-wing Progressive Writers Association, or with both. The fact that they were and continue to be household names bears further testimony to their importance within the cultural and political life of the new state. The most obvious example, obviously, is that of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, General Secretary of the All Pakistan Trade Union Federation, Editor-in-Chief of Progressive Papers Limited, which was a family of left-wing periodicals, winner of the Lenin Peace Prize, and Pakistan's unofficial poet laureate. From the very beginning, the Pakistani ruling establishment, which was comprised at that time of the property classes along with the civil and military bureaucracies, showed its anti-people colors, which were reflected in its antipathy towards the left, both of the social democratic and communist variety. And the instances of this, the biggest instance of this in the early period was the way in which they responded to the very basic democratic demands of the Bengali population in the East Pakistani province. They consistently betrayed a tendency to use Islam, and more importantly, Islamist forces, opportunistically in order to undermine progressive politics, thereby creating the conditions for the increasing power of the religious right within Pakistani society and politics. Even then, this increase in influence did not proceed in any kind of neat fashion. This is a story of contingencies, contradictions, breaks, and spikes. In the book, I try to offer an account of this contestation and these contradictions, and try to draw attention to the growing forces of radicalization and their relationship with the imperialist project, first as part of the Cold War, and currently, of course, as part of the global war on terror. So this brings us to the geopolitical backdrop against which the anti-communism of the Pakistani establishment and its deployment of Islam as a means to undermine the left played itself out. During the Cold War, the US establishment believed that Islam, particularly its radical variant, could provide an effective political-ideological bulwark against communism in Muslim countries generally, and be a thorn in the side of radical nationalist regimes in the Arab Muslim world. Now, generally, people who do think about the Cold War and US influence when it comes to Pakistan think about the Afghan War of the 1980s. But what I try to show in the book and what I'm arguing here is that actually US influence in terms of shoring up the religious right wing and radical Islamic forces far precedes that time. It actually goes all the way back to the 1950s. So Saudi Arabia's crucial function in this scheme was as an exporter of a rabidly anti-communist Islamist ideology. These Cold War scenarios were playing themselves out across the Muslim world and were not unique to Pakistan. What really set Pakistan apart, however, and decisively changed the game was the US's proxy war in Afghanistan. It was through this war that violence in the name of Islam became legitimized, the means by which to inflict it became freely available, and the networks through which it was to be operationalized were created. Thus, in Pakistan, as in other parts of the Muslim world, the rise of Islamists as a social and political force was engineered, both directly by inducting them into state institutions as General Zia did, and indirectly by cleansing the political sphere of their only effective nemesis, the left. So the story of the marginalization and decimation of the left in Pakistan is, I argue, a crucial part of the story of the Islamization of Pakistan. And it's not a part that you generally hear when that story is being told. In the immediate aftermath of independence, the reigning Muslim League Party became increasingly authoritarian, doing everything in its power to limit the democratic power of the vast majority of the population of the new state, whose interests it understood correctly as posing a fundamental challenge to its own. In West Pakistan, the only consistent critique of this authoritarianism and the other reactionary policies of the government came from left-wing members of the Progressive Writers Association. And as I said before, not just through poetry, which was a very important form of protest and resistance and has been in Pakistan for several decades, but through their journalism and through their sort of public engagement with the political issues of the time. Their detractors, major literary figures in their own right, were liberal anti-communists. This is now I'm talking about in the immediate aftermath of independence, so the late 1940s, early 1950s. The focus here on the liberal anti-communism in this period is important for a couple of reasons. First, while there was an anti-communism espoused by the religious right as well, the Islamists were not yet a significant political and social force within civil society at this time. Second, the liberal anti-communists in Pakistan were part of the International Liberal Front Against Communism, which defined what has come to be called the Cultural Cold War in this period. And it's useful to remember that the 1950s in particular are the McCarthy era in the US. By the early 1950s, Pakistan was already becoming a key American ally. And by 1953, and 1953 is important, as Dr. Qureshi reminded us, for US intervention in Iran and the overthrow of the Mossadegh prime ministership, the US had already been invited to intervene in Pakistan's political scene by the ruling clique at the center. Within this domestic and international scenario, the explicit and persistent criticism of the state and its affiliated intellectuals and writers, which was articulated by members of the Progressive Writers Association, became increasingly intolerable for the powers that be. By the time of independence in 1947, the progressive vision embodied by the Progressive Writers Association, with its twin constituent elements of socialism and anti-imperialism, had become the leading force within the literary cultural sphere in India, such that Taraqi Pasandi, or progressivism in Urdu literature, soon came to be considered synonymous with the association. It was precisely this important place which the PWA occupied within the Urdu literary community and its legacy of socialist and anti-imperialist ideas that proved to be threatening to the establishment in Pakistan immediately after independence. The classes in control of the state were determined to expel socialism and communism from the realm of legitimate politics. In order to do so, the ground had to first be cleared by the ideological construction of communists as enemies of the Pakistani nation state. Anti-communist liberal intellectuals were happy to oblige, launching a concerted smear campaign against their left-wing detractors, in which they painted them as nothing less than seditious and explicitly demanding that the state take action against them. Now, these are liberal intellectuals openly declaring in literary magazines and in newspapers that the state take action against other writers and intellectuals. By helping to smear left-wing intellectuals as seditious fifth columnists, these liberal intellectuals attempted to relegate the socialist vision to the margins of the political imaginary of ordinary Pakistanis. The consolidation of this ideological front against the left-wing writers was backed up by the coercive power of the state, which was increasingly directed against progressive publications and members of the PWA. Meetings of the association were regularly disrupted, their publications proscribed, and several of their members jailed. The climax of these repressive measures came with the arrest and trial of Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Sajjad Zahir in the Rawalpindi conspiracy case in 1951, along with some senior and junior officers of Pakistan Army who were charged with conspiring to overthrow the government. Although the state was forced to release them due to lack of evidence, but not before they had spent 3 to 4 years in various jails, the RCC gave the state the rationale it needed to finally ban the Communist Party of Pakistan and its affiliated organizations such as the Progressive Writers Association, which it did in 1954, seemingly lending credence to the charge that the progressive writers as communists were indeed enemies of the state. The crackdown on left-wing writers and intellectuals cleared the way for the establishment to take certain important steps which the relentless critique of the left had earlier made difficult. Among the most significant of these was the signing in April 1954 of the Mutual Defense and Assistance Pact with the USA, the first of many such formal Cold War alliances. However, to the extent that one of the main goals of this attack on left-wing writers and intellectuals was the purging of their influence within the cultural and political spheres, the establishment's attempts proved to be a failure. This can be gauged by the fact that while the ban on the PWA threw a pall over the cultural and political scene in West Pakistan, and that the event which is widely acknowledged to have injected life back into it was the publication, while he was still in jail, of Faiz's collection of prison poems, Zindanama. With this collection, Faiz established once and for all his status as Pakistan's unofficial poet laureate. And since I had originally titled the talk Culture, Politics and Resistance in Pakistan, I thought I would at least share some of the poetry that I normally share in my talks with you. So I wanted to share an emblematic poem from Faiz's Zindanama collection, which many of you are probably familiar with. Misal mein teri galiyon ke watan ke jahan, chali hai rasm ki koi na sar utha ke chale, जो कोई चाहने वाला तवाफ को निकले, nazar jhuka ke chale, jismo jaan bacha ke chale. Oh my country, I sacrifice myself to your streets where a new custom has been inaugurated which demands that no one can walk with head unbowed, that should a lover step out to wander the streets, he keep his gaze lowered, be mindful of his life and limb. And yet, despite the stifling new custom of the land, Faiz ends his poem with the following defiant lines. यूं ही हमेशा उलझती रही है जुल्म से खल्क, ना उनकी रस्म नई है, ना अपनी रीत नई. यूं ही हमेशा खिलाए हैं हमने आग में फूल, ना उनकी हार नई है, ना अपनी जीत नई. People have always clashed with tyranny in exactly this way. There is nothing new in the customs of the tyrants, nor in our traditions of resistance. We have always coaxed roses from flames, just as we do now. There is nothing new in their defeat, nor in our victory. So in October 1958, Pakistan experienced its first military coup, led by Field Marshal Ayub Khan, a man very close to the US establishment. Ayub Khan's regime was the most draconian period of Pakistan's short history. Immediately following the coup, many of those who were seen as having left-wing and particularly communist political leanings were swept up in a vast dragnet. This included Faiz, who was arrested in November within 2 days of his return from Moscow, where he had been attending the inauguration of the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference. The history of anti-colonial nationalism in the subcontinent had produced a strong sense of solidarity among ordinary people with other oppressed or colonized people across the world. And this internationalism had carried over after partition and independence and had become infused along with socialism into the literary mainstream of the subcontinent and also into the political mainstream of the subcontinent. As the Pakistani establishment became more and more aligned with the Cold War agenda and foreign policy of the US, whether on Palestine, Algeria, Vietnam, Iran, or Africa, this internationalism increasingly came to be seen quite rightly by them as a threat to the interests of the establishment, both the Pakistani establishment and the US establishment. Ayub Khan was particularly allergic to this post-colonial solidarity because of its organic and historical connection to communist... slow down. Ayub Khan was particularly allergic to this post-colonial solidarity because